Yeah. Which I mean, sometimes I do, but for the most part, I honestly, I record these videos, I upload them after class, and that's it. That's really all the editing that goes into it. You know, if you guys help me get to 10,000 views and I can monetize it and put ads in it, I will put sick intros in. I will put closed captioning. I'll put animation.
Sweet thumbnails.
Exactly. Actually, I did. So I used to have a channel that I posted to anonymously. It was interesting. I haven't posted to it in a couple years. And I found one of my videos actually got really popular at one point and has like 60,000 views, which is pretty crazy because it's pretty unique topics that I went over. But anyway, so back to Python. I want to go over, before we jump into Django, virtual environments. So who is familiar with virtual environments? So you know. So a virtual environment is basically a separate Python interpreter that we can store libraries in at its core, right? So this is a... So it's not bundled with anything. It basically makes a clone of your base level, whatever your default Python interpreter is, clones it into a separate interpreter that we can then activate, and inside of that interpreter, we know we have like libraries, so we can hypothetically have 10 different versions of the same package on a system. Versus, think about like globally with Python, if I were to install Django, that version of Django is what everybody uses. Whereas with a virtual environment, I can say, all right, I'm going to have this version of Django, I'm going to have this version of SQL Alchemy, I'm going to have this version of blah, 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 blah. That to be said, the other nice thing about virtual environments is this ability to have what we call a requirements.txt file. And that file and I'll show that file to you guys. Basically, that file allows us to list out what the dependencies of our project are. So when we get into, and we'll get into this at the end of the semester, when we get into deploying on the cloud, and I say that really weird, when we get into deploying on the cloud and we get into load balancing and build and deployment automation, having just that requirements.txt file is super helpful, because think about if we're deploying with like Chef, right? So Chef goes through and reads a requirements.txt file and pulls down all the dependencies I need. Versus me having to explicitly tell Chef, hey, you need this, you need this. Virtual environments, let me open a terminal here. Virtual environments are pretty straightforward. Out of the box, virtual env is what the program is called, isn't installed on our system by default. We actually have to download and run what's called Python setup tools. If I'm connected to the internet. How do you play the dinosaur game? Oh, that's neat. I've never seen that before. All right. So now that we're back on the internet, let's see, Python setup tools. And basically what setup tools does is, and you guys can, it's super easy to find, so you just download it. I can walk you guys through it. But so basically, setup tools contains the basic tools we need to work with Python, right? So we have, and really the biggest thing that's in setup tools is a program called Easy Install. An easy install is very similar to yum or apt-get in Linux. You guys all remember yum and apt-get and zipper and stuff like that. And you guys probably don't know zipper, but basically this is a package manager for Python. So I could say easy install pip. I'm not doing an external. So at least when I set this up, I had to install easy install first and then install pip with easy install. Yeah, because I typed pip. Pip's already on here. Really the goal here, so you'll install setup tools. I'm not going to do it on my machine since it's already there. You'll get easy install and you'll install pip. So Python pip is a way better package manager for Python. It's kind of like easy install, but it works a million times better. Pip is the Python standard for managing packages. So when we add things to our virtual environments, when we add things to our system environments, when we upgrade libraries, when we remove and basically downgrade libraries, we use pip. Not really for Python. There's like certain things, so like Python, there's a library called PyCrypto, and in later versions of OS X, because they changed the Open SSL implementation to account for Heartbleed, they removed some header files, some C header files. So the default installation of PyCrypto fails using pip. So you have to do it through Homebrew. Yeah, but that's the thing. That's where virtual environments come into play. So we can download a Python executable built for our machine, like a 3.0, and create a virtual environment using 3.0. So we can have a 3.0 virtual env, a 2.7 virtual env. We can have a 2.1 or 1.5. I don't remember the Python versions, but I know 2.7 and 2.6 is really where it's at. So anyway, so once you've installed easy install, you're then going to want to install pip. And I'm just Googling here. So basically what you would do is you would just do easy install pip, and then I'll get into the usage here in a second. But it's literally just once you have easy install, do easy install space pip. It will install pip for you. And then you'll also want to go ahead and do easy install actually do pip first, and then you'll do pip install virtual env. So it's already installed on my machine, so I don't have anything to do here. But this is where we get into our virtual environment. So I'm going to go ahead and make a directory called virtual environments. Now I'm going to cd into that directory. So as you guys can see, I do an ls. There's nothing. I guess I can zoom in on that a little bit, right? Is that a little easier to see? All right. So there's nothing living here right now. How we create a virtual environment is super easy. All we're going to do is once we've installed it via pip, we can just say virtual env it4045 env. And what this does is this installs the Python setup tools I talked about, which obviously contains more than just easy install. It contains pip, it contains a Python interpreter, it contains a directory structure that we can use for storing our external libraries. If I cd into my virtual env or my virtual env, let's do this. It's a little easier to read that way. So as you can see, I have a .python file that's a symbolic link to my .python file, or man, I can't talk today. My .python in the system. So this is basically cloned my system interpreter and brought it to my virtual environment. So, a couple things to note here. The first one is the bin directory. So if we go into bin and we look around, you can see we've got an activate, we have an easy install, we have a pip, we have a Python, we've got a wheel. These are all executables that I can run. So like activate, I can run outside of the virtual environment. Python and pip and stuff, I need to do what's called sourcing my virtual environment. And what sourcing does is, some of you guys have probably seen the sourcing command. I know you have. So the sourcing command basically reloads your environment variables and your terminal configuration for your terminal session. So when I run source, let me think of an example here. Let's cd out of this. Okay, so right now, if I create a shell script, so let's say echo path. So this is my path as it sits right now. If I say echo some var, there's no value there. So if I do a vim and I say sourcing.shell, and I say export some, we're not charging, var equals hello world, and I do a source of sourcing.shell. So now if I run some var, I've reloaded my environment configuration for my terminal session to include both the system, actually, yeah, it should include both the system one. So my path is still good, but to include my system one plus any changes that I've made to that environment, right? So I hypothetically, from inside of sourcing.shell, change my path. I could change my path to something completely different. And so what happens when we activate a virtual environment through source is we source that virtual environment through what's called the activate file. And if we take a look at the activate file, actually let's do cd it4045 ls activate. So as you guys can see, basically what we're doing inside of the when we do the source, what we're doing is we're redirecting and we're updating our path and we're updating our Python to point to the Python that lives inside of that virtual environment. Does that make sense? And then when we deactivate, we basically unset everything that we've set. So I can activate a virtual environment, I can run some Python, I can deactivate it and go back to my system configuration. So to activate this, I'll say source. Well, I want to show you guys one more thing. So remember when I said pip has an ability to, it's a package manager, right? So one of the things that we're going to use is pip freeze. And what pip freeze does is pip freeze basically takes a snapshot of all of the packages that we've installed for a particular virtual environment or a particular Python environment, right? So right now I can say which Python, so I'm using my system default Python. So if I do a pip freeze, it'll print out every what's the word I'm looking for here? I can't talk today. It will print out every Python library that's installed on my system. Now keep in mind, and one thing I want you guys to note is that you see I've got all of these dependencies installed. I've got Django 1.7, I've got Click, I've got Bonjour, I've got Flask, I've got NumPy, I've got OAuth, and then all the OBJC stuff. So what I want you guys to note, though, is that when I do this source bin activate, and I can do this from wherever, I just have to run source and point it to my activation file in my virtual environment. If I run pip freeze again, it's empty. Because I haven't installed any dependencies into that library that we're currently using. So now if I say which Python, now I'm pointing to my Python projects directory, virtual environments, that virtual environment bin Python. So I'm using a completely different Python executable. So that is virtual environment in a nutshell. So the really cool thing here, like I said, is this ability to not only, and I'll show you the ability to very quickly install the dependencies you need, but then also this ability to have multiple versions of different libraries on the same system. So that being said, let's hop onto GitHub and download the github.com and download the example Django project that we're going to use. I already updated that. Why is it still giving me issues? Don't ever leave your debit card in the ATM. It's a huge pain when you have to cancel it. Yeah, I canceled it. I plugged in the new payment method. It didn't. I must have plugged it in wrong. Anyway, let's see. So I have about 30 private repositories. So, no, this is, so we have a GitHub Enterprise account for work. Yeah, no, this is my personal stuff. I've got some IP to me that I don't want just out there in the world. So I pay, I think, 15, because I've got like 30, I think. Now some of that is like old graduate programming assignments, because I ran into some issues because I love loading everything into GitHub. So I would load stuff into GitHub. Other students would find it. They would clone mine, hand in basically the same assignment, and I'd get accused of plagiarism. I'm like, see, this is when I started mine. So, which is fine if you make them private. Anyway, so if you are able to find my personal GitHub account, there is a project on there called Generic Django Project. And I'm going to upload this to the UC one, that way you guys can just go to that and clone it down. But basically, this is a pre-built Django environment without a requirements.txt file. Son of a bitch. Okay. Anyway, so we're going to go ahead and clone this and then step through setting it up and using it and doing all of the really basic stuff that we need to do in Django. So I'll go back to my Python projects. I'll do git clone. Oh, it's already in there. Python projects. See, okay. Oh, yeah, I remember what I did this for. Okay, okay, okay. Yeah, it's one of my favorite little um, logs to put in. Okay, so I'm gonna upload to this version to UC GitHub because this is the one that's actually updated. Couple things to note. So when you clone it, we're gonna want to change the name, and changing the name of the project in Django is not quite as easy as it is in maybe a different language because there's a lot of there's places in the Django project that use the name to find other files. So really, I'm trying to think. Let's dive into this. So Django operates on a series of apps, right? So, and what an app in Django is, it's just a Python module. Inside of generic Django project, I have an app called generic Django project. And this is really, typically this is where the main app will be, right? So this is where all of your main generic configuration content will live. It doesn't have to be named generic. It doesn't have to be named the same thing as your project is in PyCharm. To me, it's easier to understand, but you can call it whatever you want. And you'll notice that inside of this package, there's a subpackage called migrations, which we're not going to worry about today. There is an admin.py file. This admin.py file basically registers well, I won't even get into that because we don't know what models are yet. We have a models.py, and this file is where we're creating all of our ORM. So this is where we're creating our objects and mapping them to the database so we can pull data in and out. You guys can already see way easier to do this than it is with Java. Way easier. Then we have a settings file. And this settings file, I strongly recommend you use the pre-configured settings file that I have been putting out there. The reason being, so Django uses this concept of static file loading from a URL within the server. Right? So when I go to load an HTML or JavaScript or a CSS file, I'm not loading it from the file system, I'm loading it from the server itself. So in order to do that, I have to configure template loaders, I have to configure template directories, I have to configure a static URL to get like my JavaScript and CSS to work. So it's just so much easier to clone this down versus trying to build it on your own. Because out of the box, if we use there's an executable called Django admin, which I'll get to in a minute, which is like our Django management script. When we can create new apps and we can create new Django projects using the Django admin script. However, it won't configure static directories or template files or anything like that. So it's just so much easier to pull down this version of the settings file and update accordingly. But we'll get back to settings as well. We also have a urls.py, and what urls.py does is this is where we do all of our URL routing, right? Remember how in JSF we had this automatic URL or this automatic view resolution, right? This dynamic view resolution. In Django, we actually have to specify what our URLs are going to be. That to be said, we specify our URL, but then we can just point out. Then we can basically point that URL to a function endpoint, right? So remember in Flask when we created a very basic test function that we could hit in a browser and get back data. basically in Django, we're just mapping a URL to a Python function, which I'll get into in a little bit. We have a views.py, and this views.py is where we put all of our functions that map to URLs, just like the ones that we saw in, urls.py, right? So in here, you can see my index, my home, points to generic Django project views index. And then if I go into views, you can see I've got an index function. And then finally here, we have what's called a WSGI file. Don't call it a WSGI, it's a WSGI file. A WSGI file basically loads our Django settings module for us. Django settings module, in case you guys didn't gather from the walkthrough of the basic app, this is settings.py, is what it is. And so there's certain environment variables that get set inside of settings.py, like base directory, secret key, installed apps, middleware classes, things like that, that without knowing what those environment variables are, the Django app won't run. So, oh, there's a couple more things. So static is where I'm sticking the templates and where I'll stick the JavaScript and CSS and images, but we'll get to all that in a later day, early next week. Well, probably what we'll do is work from the top down, just like we did with JSF, because the templating is a little bit different. And I personally think it's a lot easier in Django than it is in JSF, but that's up to you guys to decide. So we have a static directory, which is at the same level as our app. So this is in the base, the project root, and then we have, if we ignore these other files here, that client demo is just, I don't remember what that is. So we're just gonna delete these. Yeah, I don't care. So really what we're left with is a manage.py, and this is a built-in Django file. And what this does is this allows us to run certain tasks within Django, right? So starting our Django server, updating our database, creating new tables from the models, things like that. We then have a requirements.txt, which is, although it's not generated by Django, highly recommended to always have one of these in your Django project. The reason being, if you ever have to start over, if you ever screw something up, really easy to just blow away your virtual environment and start over. Every time you add a dependency, you should probably just do a pip freeze into requirements.txt and just have a new one. We have a SQLite JDBC jar. That is not a Django file. That's something that I throw into this project. It makes it so that we can. It makes it such that we can connect to storage.db, which is a SQLite database, as you guys can see. Stupid thing wants to stay connected. Which is a SQLite database that we just point to for testing purposes. So if we go back into settings.py, and I know this is probably, if we remember from JSF, to do ORM, we had to use Hibernate or something like it. In Django, it's built-in. So we're actually, in Django, we're required to have this databases dictionary. And what this databases dictionary does is it points us to, we have to have a default. We can point to multiple databases, but we have to have a default and point that to an engine, have a name for it, which is either the file name or the host name. Generally speaking, we use this, I mean, not generally speaking, My recommendation is to just clone my project, use StorageDB, and build out yours from there. A username, a password, a host, a port. So name is technically just the name of the other connection, or the file name. So all that to be said, one thing that we're going to have to do before we can start this project is we're going to have to tell PyCharm which Python interpreter to use. What PyCharm interpreter should we be using for this assignment, or for this project? What was that? But which virtual environment? Probably the one that we just created. Yeah. So we'll go into preferences, and if you guys remember, very similar to IntelliJ, we just change our, we just add an interpreter. So we say add local, PyCharm projects. So, get it? Create virtual environment. Yeah. So we can, from within, if you've set everything up in PyCharm correctly, we actually can have PyCharm create a virtual environment for us and even do dependency management all from within the IDE. It's a little buggy, so I don't use it. So we'll do add local. We can also add a remote Python interpreter from an external server if we really wanted to. So we'll come in here and go to virtual environments, bin Python. And so we don't want to point to this Python 2.7 file because it is a symbolic link. We want to point to the plain Python executable. So we add that, and you can see, so we've added a project interpreter, and these are the dependencies we have installed. So I hit OK, and I come in here and I say which Python, still pointing to the wrong one. So open the terminal here, and we'll do cd. So we'll do source, virtual environments, IT4035, env, bin, activate. So now I've activated my virtual environment. So now what I want to do is I want to go from within my generic Django project. I want to type pip install requirements.txt -R, and what capital R means is I want to recursively install from a file. Forgot there's an order to this. Yeah, so pip install -r requirements.txt. So now, as you guys can see, I've installed all of my requirements. So if I do a pip freeze just to be sure, now I've got a bunch of different requirements. So now what I can do if I want to start the Django server is I can say python manage.py, because remember we have this manage.py file, and I just say run server. So now it should be up and running at localhost port 8000, and my Django server is up and running. Pretty easy, right? Now what if I want to change the name of this application? Not as simple as refactoring. So there's a few steps that we're going to have to take in order to rename this project, right? So the first one is going to be I'm going to rename the top level directory. Well, I'm going to rename the project. So I renamed the project, which basically renames what it shows up as in IntelliJ, but it doesn't rename the directory. So now I'm going to rename the directory, and I'm just doing function shift F6, IT 4045 app. I don't want to do a safe search. Do refactor. So then I'll rename the app as well. Yeah, don't search. More VCS errors. Okay. So refactor, rename, IT 4045 app. So now I've renamed my top level directory. I've renamed my Django, my first Django app. So now there's just a couple more things I need to check for. I need to check for any occurrences of generic Django project inside of settings.py, inside of views or URLs. So there's nothing in settings.py. Had we not done the extensive refactoring through the IDE, URLs.py wouldn't have worked either, or would have been refactored. So this all now says IT4045 app. Typically, if we didn't do it through the IDE, we would have to rename it through. We'd have to come into this file and actually change the occurrences of generic Django project to IT4045 app, which is the name of the Django app inside of our project. And if we check WSGI, WSGI's been changed too. Now, if I come in here and I try to run my project again, it should just fire right up. Okay, so we're fired up. Pretty simple. Any questions about renaming or virtual environments? Anything we've covered so far? Take the silence as a no. Let's see here. Man, I need to start bringing more pop to class. All right, so we have an index page in our Django project, but having an index page in our Django project does what for us? It really doesn't do anything. So what if we wanted to, say we want to add a new endpoint, say we want to add a new page. So to add a new page, there's a few steps we need to take. The first thing we'll want to do is we'll want to go into urls.py, and we're going to want to create a new URL that will point to our new page. So let's see. I really need to go through and refactor all of this because it's pointing to an old version of this. Okay. So what I'll do is I'll plug in a new URL, and this is a basically this file. It's a URL patterns file, or basically uses. I can't talk today. Let's see. Basically, patterns is a function inside of the Django comp URLs module, and what we do is we just generate our URL patterns using function arguments, right? So I've got my index, so now I want to add a new one, and I'll say call it login. Let's call it login. So login. So I've added a URL for login. So now I need to add a corresponding view to actually return something back to the user when we go to that URL. I also need to be sure that whatever view function right here that I point this URL to, right? So the first part of this is the URL string. It's a regex. It basically is the / whatever's after the /. So is it login slash? Is it just login? That's the first part. That's what the user will enter in the screen. So then we need to map them to, using this dot notation, a Python function that will return something. We need to make sure that the function that we're pointing them to actually exists inside of where we say it's supposed to exist, right? So in this case, we say it exists in IT4045 app as the module, right? So, or the Django app, and then we say, all right, so we're inside of that. We're inside of IT4045 Django app. We're inside of the views module or views Python file, and we're using the login function, and we're giving it name login. And what this name keyword argument is, and I'll talk about keyword arguments probably next week, is we don't have to worry about it too much right now, but when we get into doing redirects and stuff like that, instead of having to point to a hard URL for a redirect, we can do basically a reverse lookup and redirect to just the name of that URL. So if we go into views.py, you can see obviously there's no login function, so can't hit login. So we need to create a new function. So we'll say def login, which obviously points to, which just matches the name that we have in urls.py. And anytime we have a view function, we have to pass it a parameter called request. Now the request argument is basically, it corresponds to the HTTP request that's coming in from the client, right? So think about in some of the other frameworks we've looked at, right? So like our Flask demo, for example. In Flask, we have to import request, but then we can pull things out from the headers or from the form. We can identify the method. So is it post? Is it put? Is it get? I feel like there's one more. There's 4 or 5 HTTP anyway. So unlike in Flask where we have to import it and pull it to us, in Django, that request is automatically passed to our function. So we have to plan for an argument to be called, or an argument to be passed into a function. So the simplest way to do this, right, is or the simplest way to handle this is to do a return render, so call the render method from Django shortcuts. And what render does, so we're returning the result of a function call. What render is doing is basically taking the request, taking index.html, and then this dictionary of variables that we're going to pass into our template. Remember in JSF how when we wanted to get data to the facelet, right? So our .jsf file or .xhtml file, we had to set an attribute on a managed bean, or we had to call a method on a managed bean. In Python, well, I'm sorry, in Django, we don't have to do that. We just pass in this dictionary of key values. So the key is how we'll access it in our Django template, which we'll look at in a second, with the value that's going to be shown in the template. And then we pass it a template name. So pretty straightforward. So we'll say request login.html, and I won't pass in any keyword arguments because there's not really a reason to. So I go ahead and I save that. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump into my static directory. And inside of static, there's a directory called templates. I'm going to go ahead and create a new HTML file and call it login.html. It already exists. I didn't see that. Let's see. We're just going to get rid of all this. So, well, I can keep some of it. Authenticate. So, this is our login form. And at its core, or I'm sorry, so this is a Django template. Just a plain HTML file. It's not an XHTML. It's not a .tpl file. It's not anything like that. It's just a plain old HTML file. So you'll notice a couple things happening here at the top. The first one is this these curly braces with % and URL authenticate. If you guys remember from the urls.py file, where we had specified a name for that URL, this is a case of that, right? So we're doing a very similar in this situation. We're doing a very similar thing to what we're doing in JSF, in that we are pointing a URL to dynamically. We're basically saying in the template, all right, somewhere out there is a URL called authenticate in this project. Find it and redirect them to, and send this data there. So we can leave that as it sits. There is a Python syntax, or I'm sorry, there's a Django template syntax that we'll get into here in a second. But you'll notice after that we also have a CSRF_token, and I'll get into that a lot later. That's some more advanced thing. All we need to know is that inside of our Django forms, we have to include a CSRF token. And basically, a CSRF token. Do any of you guys know about CSRF tokens? So a CSRF token stands for cross-site registry forest token. And basically, what this does is this is just a token that is automatically generated for us that allows it adds us an extra layer of security, right? It basically prevents somebody. What was that? Yeah. It basically prevents cross-site scripting. So we just have to add it there. That way we can't log into the app. So that to be said, the rest of this is pretty simple, right? So let's actually go back and add a variable here. So if I go back into views and I add a let's call this description. So I'll add a key value that I want to pass into our login form. So to pass in this to access these keywords that we're passing, or to access the key values stored in the dictionary that we're passing to this template, it's pretty easy. We do double braces, so double open braces, double close braces, and then just call the name of the dictionary value that we want to access. So in this case, description. And so then I can come in and say, I can say input type equals text, name equals username, label 4 equals username, right? That's how we do label, right? So with 4, label 4 username, right? Okay, cool. And then we'll repeat the process with password. So, what was that? Nope. I'll say button type equals submit. Login. You guys are probably super sick of doing login pages by now, I would imagine. Okay, so what are some takeaways from what I'm looking at here versus what it would take me to code up login page in JSF? No managed beans, no mapping of form members to the back end, right? So I'm literally writing raw HTML that I'm going to be able to pull back from the request argument of the view function. So I've coded up my form. If I go ahead and actually normally Django will automatically reload. So if I go to localhost on port 8000 and I say login, localhost refused to connect. Why? Login. Oh, that's right. So if I rerun, so I restart my Django server and I run that. So now the login page hit. We hit the URL, but we got an error. No reverse match at login. Reverse for authenticate with arguments empty tuple and keyword arguments empty dictionary not found, 0 patterns tried. Does anybody know what we did wrong? I know we're really early. I know we're really new to looking at Django, but I figure I'll put it out there. So I can make this even easier. Look at line 2 of login.html. No, the post is fine. Our form action is pointing to the named URL authenticate, but that URL doesn't exist. So when we go to render that HTML, because we've never even created that URL, Django is like, what the hell? I can't find this URL. Throw an exception. So now I got to go into URLs, and I've got to add the authenticate mapping. So we'll say authenticate. We'll say do login. Actually, let's say login. No, let's call it do login. And just to prove how dynamic this is, let's give this a really weird name. Let's give this URL a really weird name. Because if we use the named URL convention, right? Because I never am really, because realistically, this this do login view function should only ever get something passed to it from login. I can call this whatever I want. So We'll give it a really weird, obscure URL name. Yeah. So I've done that. So I'm going to go ahead and kill my Django server. Clear. Oh, it's still running. What was that? Not usually. If we run it in the IDE, it will actually reload for us, or do a hot swap. I don't know, and sometimes it does it on the terminal too. I guess it's just not detecting the changes. I think part of it relies on Git to auto reload everything. So ps aux grep python. Let's say kill -9 5668. Okay. So run the server, reload, view does not exist. So we forgot, so we didn't make them function. Yeah. Yeah, the function doesn't exist. That's a little pet peeve of mine. So in Python, functions are methods. In every other language, it's a function. It's like a mathematical function. Okay, so we've got to do that. We got to create a function called doLogin. So in doLogin, what do we want to do here? We want to authenticate. Based upon what we did in JSF, do we want to do all of our authentication logic inside of views.py? No, because and I didn't really want to get into this today, but basically, so Django is just like JSF in one big way, and that's that it's a 3-tier architecture. The Django architecture is it's an MVC, it's a model view controller. We can very easily see that in action, or basically we can very easily see that structure in that. So we have a model. We have models.py, which maps all of our database models to Python classes, or all of our database tables to Python classes. Does it automatically for us. That's the models piece. The views piece, and this is something that confuses the hell out of people, and I don't know why. The views piece is a combination, the view piece is a combination of views.py across all of your Django apps. So I can have 100 sub apps inside of my generic or my IT4045 app. I can have, a Django app for login. I can have a Django app for shopping. I can have a Django app for, I don't know, whatever you want to call it, right? However you want to break up your website. The views is a combination of templates, which we saw. So templates is that HTML and CSS and JavaScript and Ajax and all of that stuff, and HTML, and then the Python view function, which returns that back to the user. The controller piece is not explicitly stated anywhere in the Django model. The reason, and what I mean by that is, so we have a views file, and we have template files, and we have a models file. We don't have a controller file. Generally, what I do is I create a function called, I create a Python file called functions.py. And what functions.py does, for me, and again, you can structure your project how you want, and this is why I do this. So what functions.py has is it has the high-level functions that I'm going to call in my controller or my business logic layer, right? Remember from JSF when we were talking about business logic, the same principle applies in Python, but we call it the controller tier. So what lives in functions is going to be things like, I'll have like an authenticate method. And if I know authenticate is going to be this really big, robust method, maybe I want to break, or it's going to call a bunch of sub-methods, maybe I want to break that all out into a separate file. So then I just import that file and call what I need. But really the point I wanted to drive here is that because we're a 3-tier architecture, because we're doing the separation of components, and remember from JSF when we separated our components, it was a lot easier to make changes on the back end without negatively impacting the front end. Right? We were able to completely overhaul the data delivery in the back end without ever having to touch the front end. Same thing with Django, that's why we want to separate out. And with that being said, so in this do login method, I just want to call a function in my controller tier that will do my login for me. So I'll say from, I'll say from functions import authenticate. And so then I'll go into functions and I'll do a def authenticate request return true. Actually, yeah, we'll return true for right now. So I go into do login. So now I could say do login request and then return HTTP response reversed index. So what did I just whoops, I just made that recursive. So what did I just do here? I created a do login view. I called an authenticate function, which is just stubbed in, it returns true, and then I do a return raw HTTP response, right? So when we return this HTTP response, we're literally returning some form of raw HTTP data. That can be JSON, that can be XML, that can be CSV, that can be HTML. We use the render when we want to render a template, pass in parameters, and return something visually appealing to the user screen. But when we want to return raw data like JSON, or when we want to, in this case, call reversed and pass in index, and what the trying to think. You know what? I got that wrong. So reversed is not what I was thinking of, but basically what I'm trying to do here is return a reverse lookup of my index URL, right? So I've logged them into my app, and then I'm redirecting them back to the index. Does that make sense? Hell of a lot easier than JSF, right? Yeah. So honestly, and next week when we get into doing our models, it's going to be super, super, super easy to add in a user class, add users, do the login piece, right? Because what we'll do is we'll write, there's built-in encryption in Django as well, but we'll write a very simple encryption module to encrypt the password. So what we'll do is we'll encrypt our passwords, we'll store that in a database, we'll retrieve that encrypted password, encrypt the user input, compare that to what we have in the database, and do an auth based upon that. And then store all of that via cookies or via session variables. So, any questions about basics of Django templates or basics of views or the architecture here? Yes. Every single URL.
There's no like patterns in other languages like C#. Like you can say, I want the pattern to be controllers view ID, and then I'll find the controller name and the view name, and I'll just plug it into every situation.
Now that I think about it, I think there is a similar patterns in Django. But
I mean, I'm just thinking for like big
Yeah.
applications.
Now I will say this: you would be surprised in that, in a lot of cases, you do literally map it all by hand like that. But that to be said, when you're dealing with enterprise level Django, you're breaking it up. So you don't end up with a 10,000 line urls.py because we create multiple Django apps. So we have an IT4045 app. So this is going to store like index. Ideally, IT4045 app would have one URL entry for index. So then we would have we'd have an authentication app, and that would have the login stuff, the logout stuff, the user permissions. Maybe not user permissions, but like updates to profile information and stuff like that.
So Django is like modularized.
Yes. In Django, ideally, we want to be able to take individual apps and add them as we want and remove them as we want. Right? So say I have an entire section of a site for like RSS feeds. Nobody uses RSS feeds anymore to my knowledge. I want to pull that out, so I just grab the RSS module and rip it out.
And it's easy to communicate between the apps. Like, real time.
Oh, super easy, right? It's just structure.
It's just
It's just structure for the project itself, right? So once this is loaded, it flattens it all out. It's all horizontal, right? So if this login lived in something called authentication, I'd literally just say authentication.views.login. So nope, super simple. All right. Any other questions, guys? I will get that stuff about database migration posted tonight. If you've already created your schema for your project, super easy to rename it. Just go into MySQL Workbench, double-click the name, rename it, good to go. So I'll get that posted. There was one other thing you guys needed me to post. There's that, and then the note about the naming convention. Okay. Okay. Yeah. Okay, cool. All right, if there's nothing else, I'll get this video uploaded here momentarily, and then